Okay, hello everybody. I'm Matt. I do the videos on the Varsity Bookworm channel, and I'm here with my friend Garrett for another conversation. How are you, Garrett?
Doing well. Thanks for bringing me on again. I'm
Yeah,
looking forward to it.
yeah. Thanks for coming on. So the plan for today is we're gonna do kind of a conversation about a book that Garrett had suggested I read the last time we talked, which was the Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And you've read it a few times, so I'm looking forward to learning a little bit about what you think about it too. So, um, did you want to talk about how you wanted to go about doing this, or?
Well, first I'll go ahead and categorize the book, and I'll do it with a little bit of forcefulness. I'm pretty confident in asserting that this is probably the greatest book of the 19th century. It's on a scale that I can't really contend with. I mean, the only books that I can think of that even come close to it as far as just prowess is concerned, as far as a writer can ever be concerned, is probably Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. And as far as the aspects of the novel that really pull you in, that you can't really put your finger on, it's psychological stuff. It's like, so Freud was really into Dostoevsky, and one of the things Freud said about Dostoevsky is that he could have chosen to be the liberator of all mankind, but instead chose to be its jailer. And that's
Hmm.
pretty tough words coming from Freud. Freud wasn't somebody to mince words. The idea was that Dostoevsky had a knack for highlighting the most like intimately quirky and dark elements of the human psyche. And all of that is on display in this symphony of characters uh, in this book called Brothers Karamazov. So, as far as how we should structure it, I was thinking maybe we could just sort of talk about the themes and the ideas that sort of jumped off the page for you, and some of which jumped off the page for me after reading it a couple times, and then sort of just go from there and make an organic conversation about one of the greatest books ever written.
Sounds good to me. Do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, sure, I can go with it. So first of all, there's a primary theme. There's a primary theme that's sort of hovering over the entire work from the moment that you get past the introduction to the literally the very last page of the book. And that theme is the question as to whether or not God is essentially dead. Has science killed God? Has the intellect grown to a point? Has human reason grown to a point where we don't actually need God anymore? And the question is, I think, posited in either the third or fourth chapter of the book when they all convene at Fyodor's house. So, just as a quick overview, the book takes place in Russia in the 19th century, uh, not long after the serfs have been freed by the Tsar, and it follows the account of a father and his four sons: Dmitri, the oldest; Ivan, the middle child, or the second oldest; Smerdyakov, his illegitimate child; and Alyosha, who is the hero of the novel. So that's kind of the overview. And really, all it is this big family drama that ends up encapsulating ideas such as parricide or murder of a parent, um, the nature of political society and where it's headed, and the ideas associated with religious themes that were really popular back in 18th or 19th century Russia. So yeah, the one theme that really jumps off, of course, is the God is dead theme. And the idea is that it's sort of set up in a hypothetical syllogism, but it takes a little bit of some looking to notice it. And so the syllogism is set up a bit like this: if God is dead, then all is permitted,
Hmm.
right? So how the book ends up, what Dostoevsky, I believe, thought he was doing with the book was proving the existence of God through this syllogism. So the idea is, if God is dead, then all is permitted. All is not permitted, therefore God is not dead.
Mm.
And that's a theme that I thought was very powerful. And everybody that's read the book knows it's a very powerful theme that sort of just pervades the book the entire time you're reading it. So what do you think about that?
That yeah, the putting it as a syllogism is interesting. Um, as far as um, the all is permitted thing, that was something that had stuck out to me. Um, and I'm glad you led off with that, because that was actually one of the things I was hoping to get your perspective on. Um, was the way, I guess the way I look at it is, and I think I may have said this the last time we talked a little bit, when I was talking about existential nihilism, is that the way I look at it is that there's this idea that a lot of people have that, if there's no God, there's no meaning to life, or no objective meaning, or more importantly, that if there's no God, then you're free, basically. And I guess another way of putting that would be, everything is permitted. That's that motto is kind of, I think, first introduced by Ivan, and then others kind of pick it up. Smirjakov starts picking it up and parroting that, and a couple of the other characters, I think, kind of wrestle with that. Whoever was at that dinner, it seems to have wrestled with that. Um, for me, the way I look at it is, I guess I've started to wonder if that's necessarily the case, that only if there's no God is there real freedom. I think the flip side is that there's this idea that if there is a God, then there's certain things that are permitted and certain things that aren't. And I guess the way that I look at it is that doesn't really change whether there's a God or not, because at least if you believe in a God that allows for free will or gives people free will, I guess those are two very different phrases. But if there's a God and there's freedom of some variety or some degree, I think that is something that's at least conceivable. So for me, I've never been able to be led through that line of reasoning to where, like, if there's no God, then there's freedom. So good news. But if, there is a God, then, there's certain things you got to do and certain things you don't. The way I look at it is like, well, people can still do whatever they want, um, whether there's a God or not, I guess, would be kind of the simplest way of putting that.
A good way to look at it is, let's say there was a God, and that particular God happens to be the one of the Bible. Then if that's the case, then yeah, freedom is intrinsic to your being, irrespective of what you end up doing with it. But there's going to be consequences, which is the idea of all is not permitted, right? Which is what Dostoevsky was driving at. See, the reason why this was such an important question back then is because the framework of perception around the concept of ethics has been skewed for hundreds of years, right? I actually brought this up in a philosophy forum recently, is that questions of objectivity or subjectivity or divine dissemination, those kinds of questions are not applicable to conceptual frameworks devised by humans to produce the most optimal representation of whatever that domain entails. So what I mean by that is humans devised mathematics, right? Mathematics are not objective. Numbers don't exist in reality, but we devised this conceptual framework to be able to map values onto what we perceived as consistent patterns across different domains in the universe. The same thing goes for science. Science itself isn't objective. It's a conceptual framework used to produce the most optimal results out of observation. And the same thing is true of the concept of ethics. Irrespective of whether or not there's a God, the field of ethics is a conceptual framework by which humans can extract out of reality and out of results of behavior the most optimal behavior for that person to conduct to produce the best results possible for not only his own life, but for the people that he is interacting with as far as interpersonal harmony is concerned. So the reason why this like seems so towering is because for hundreds of years people weren't really thinking about it in terms of how I just described it. They were thinking about it, well, if there's no God, well, then there's no morality at all. And it's like, let's say we disregard everything that I just said and there was no God. That also wouldn't imply no morality. It's like we're a species that has evolved over like 300 million years. And that evolutionary psychology is a part of our construct. And that evolutionary psychology entails proper behavior in social situations and in personal situations. You can't just go out and conduct the most destructive behavior you think that you can get away with and expect good results out of it. So although the question, the idea is God dead? I would say, honestly, at this point, Dostoevsky is dead, not just literally, but figuratively as well. We no longer need that question. And although it is staggering of a question to ask back then, I think fundamentally we should move on from it because, well, we've kind of, as far as I'm concerned, covered it. But it wasn't that straightforward when Dostoevsky was writing. And I mean, it's still troubling people to this day, But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people who are atheist or agnostic would probably reject the idea that because they're atheist or agnostic, they should go around living like the libertines of the Marquis de Sade's novels or something like that, just doing whatever, hurting whoever, just because, well, hey, nothing matters. Let's just do whatever we feel like. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of ways of looking at that. The biological argument. There's been biologists and ethicists and ethical biologists, I guess, who have come out and said, hey, there's biological evolutionary reasons why we are, for example, altruistic, all that stuff. There's other people that say, hey, that biological thing doesn't really work for me, but the fact that we, like you said, are able to conceive of these rules and stuff kind of there must be something innate to us that we're capable of coming up with these systems, to regulate our behavior. You've got Hobbes, who says kind of the same, I guess, not really from the same starting point, but same results in terms of the biological thing, that there's some reason why we behave ourselves, and it mostly has to do with continuing to live. But so basically there's any atheist or agnostic philosopher or writer or person that I know. I don't know of any that I don't know of many, I guess, who have seriously thought about it and come up with well, everything is permitted, maybe when someone is younger, I guess, or first starting to explore these ideas, especially if they're very young when they start to explore these ideas, that might be the first thing that comes to mind. I mean, it certainly was for me when I started reading Nietzsche. One of the first ideas I had was, yeah, let's just party. This is, yeah. But I think that's something that most people will either grow out of, or they never go into it at all. But yeah, I don't think most most atheists or agnostic, non-theistic people would probably say that that all is permitted. But they have there's a bunch of different ways of going about it. and this has been going on since, like, the ancient Greek philosophy. The example I always think of is the Euthyphro, where the question is, why is what is good what is good? You know,
Mhm.
if it's good because the gods say that it's good, well, why did they say so? Is it because they are compelled to decree something as good? Well, then what compels them to do so?
Right.
And if there's something that can compel God to say this is good and this is bad, then that, whatever that is, must, basically what that would mean would be that God is subject to morality rather than morality being subject to God. And in either case, what the heck do we do with that information?
Right.
And interestingly, I don't know if I think the conversation Socrates was having in the Euthyphro had to do with the guy's father being on trial, or
Yeah.
yeah. So the
Yeah.
father and the you know um, kind of the brothers Karamazov, kind of an unscrupulous character as well. But
Actually, yeah, that's really what I fundamentally gleaned from the novel. So you've got this father who's had a couple wives, one illegitimate son, and you're contrasted, right? So you've got the father and the four sons, and you've got the father who fundamentally represents corrupt sensualism and indulgence. You've got the son, the first son, who embodies irrational pride and the confusion that comes with that. And you've got the younger son, uh, just younger than Dmitri, Ivan, who embodies consuming brilliance, so to speak. His intelligence has gone far beyond the point of usefulness to his own life. And then you've got Smerdyakov, who embodies resentment. And then you have the hero of the novel, Alyosha, who's the youngest of them, who embodies angelic purity. And the idea fundamentally towards the end of the book is, well, let's say, and this is what Fechikovich, the lawyer, presents to the court case whenever they're taking him to trial. Let's say he did kill his dad, right? What happens if his dad wasn't his dad, right? Fechikovich has a really strikingly strong statement he poses to the court, which is, a father is not he who begets. A father is he who begets and proves himself worthy of having done so. And so you've got this story of all these four kids that fundamentally are asking all of these questions about the nature of God being dead and all this crazy stuff they're going through, mainly because the father didn't choose to do what fathers are supposed to do and responsibly raise their kids. And I think this is at the core of it, like past all of the philosophy, past all of the religion and stuff. At the core of the novel is a story about a family gone awry. That's why the first chapter opens up nice little family, right? The first chapter is called Nice Little Family. And it's not a nice little family. These kids are all spread off all over Russia independently. By the time I think Alyosha's 20 or so in the book, he's 20 before he ever meets either of his two brothers. The oldest son's only met his dad once or twice. Ivan's never met his dad. Smerdyakhov's been living with the dad the whole time, but he's this angry, resentful kid because he's never been accepted by his father, even though he's just as much of a Karamazov as the rest of them. And it's no wonder to me that it's him who ends up being the one who kills Fyodor. Specifically, Smerdyakov does,
mhm.
because he's the resentful, disregarded child, right? So really, at the core of this story, you have a lot of like religion and really cool like philosophical themes and stuff, but that's what's at the core is the family and how it gets destroyed and what that does to society and everybody around the family. Because like the only person that ends up okay at the end of the novel is the hero, right? Everybody
Mhm.
else, their whole lives are ruined because this dad just wouldn't man up and be the father to these kids that he should have been. Awesome concept.
Yeah, he actually Fyodor kind of I thought his character was actually hilarious at certain points. Like he's just so it took me a while to figure out why, and it kind of in the first few books of the Brothers Karamazov, I at some point I was like, he kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you ever watched It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Kind of reminds me of Frank, of, you know, in terms of being a horrible father, and also he's not really their father, and he's just vile and
Right.
you know, hurtful to everybody around them. And I was like, wow, maybe we'll have to look at that show again. Maybe that's a modern retelling of of Fyodor uh,
Well,
Pavlovich in a way.
it's archetypal, right?
Hmm.
Like it's an archetypal story. Like the father is always going to be the person who has to take responsibility for his kids. He created them, right? His kids didn't ask to be created. So they have, in their own little way, a right to the resources available to the father. We're an altricial species. What that means is we have a very long rearing period as opposed to other animals. We've got about a
Hmm.
20-year rearing period, and that's in the best of cases anymore. It's
Yeah.
like the father is supposed to be the person who raises his kids. That's why he's the father. And if he doesn't do that, and the kids actually make it to adulthood, it's like, be warned, man. Beware. And that's what the story poses. And what's cool about this is it starts off telling you about Alyosha and why fundamentally he's the hero, right? So by the time you meet Alyosha, he's a novice at the local monastery by choice, right?
Hmm.
He's lived in the town for a handful of months and he hasn't really gone and seen his father. And he's done this by choice because he knows about his dad, right? But the rest of the kids are all around Fyodor by choice, right? And they're being influenced by him by choice. Even Ivan's got sort of dark thoughts toward him. Smerdyakov clearly has murderous thoughts towards him. He's insanely envenomed by bitterness and resentment. And actually, what's funny is the book presents to you Ivan as the sort of intelligent one. But if you go read that book again, check out who's actually the smart one. It's Smerdyakov. So,
Yeah, I thought he was a little more like
mhm,
cunningly intellectual than Ivan. Ivan is sort of he doesn't I don't know, it's like very impersonal, I guess. You know, while Dimitri is like the other extreme where, you know, um is fixated on I get, there's like so many ways you could look at like the archetypes they all represent, like the different like I was thinking of like the different stages of life that Kierkegaard has, of the, you know, the ethical, the religious, the aesthetic. You know, one of the things he talks about is that the aesthetic can be someone who, you know, is, you know, sensuous with like relationships, other people, but they could also be like intellectually sensuous and like,
yeah,
you know,
indulgent.
consuming fine art and poetry, all this stuff. Kierkegaard did not have a lot of respect for poetry. But then the uh the um the religious being something that kind of goes beyond both of those two without totally getting rid of either of them, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, talking about Kierkegaard, I don't think he could have lived in this world with his specific construct
No.
without religion. I don't think he could have. I mean, he regarded everything in the world just like Fyodor did. It's all one big joke, right? Like, so that's the one thing that you pick up on with Fyodor is that he regards everything that you people are talking about as nothing more than a point of my humor. And
Hmm.
if you're in any way disrupting my humor, I want you out of my house. Now, you can contrast that with Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard quite literally thought everything was so disgustingly humorous, right? He thought everything was a disgusting joke. Art wasn't just not art, it was so abhorrently stupid and banal that the only way he could make sense of and it was like that with everything, not just art. The only way he could make sense of it is to assume that there has to be some sort of divine realness outside of reality. Like this can't be the only reality I'm confined to. Whereas Fyodor reveled in it.
I think that was one of the things I enjoyed the most about Fyodor's character was like Dostoevsky talks about how he plays the fool, and like acts stupid for his own amusement, I guess. He like gets amused by other people thinking he's a buffoon, which I guess he kind of is, but he must not be totally stupid because he knows what he's doing. You know, when he goes back to the monastery after you know, causing a scene there where Zosima ends up bowing before them and they're all trying to like figure out what the heck does that mean? The monk just bowed to us, you know,
Right.
especially after we behaved so badly. And then he goes back and is like, I could probably make things even worse if I go back now and do something even stupider, you know? But it's like, in a way, he's like, he is kind of smart, I guess, at doing stupid things, and pretend. I don't really know what's, I never really understood what the point of it was, other than I guess his own amusements. I don't know if you had any thoughts on why he would play the buffoon all the time.
No, because I mean, you'd be jumping into questions of psychology. And I mean, I personally have met people like Fyodor. Um, they're the most elusive creatures on the planet, these people. And again, I kind of bring it back to what I said earlier. They're the kind of people that make a joke out of everybody and everything. They're the jester, so to speak, in the king's court. It's where we get the concept of the Joker,
Hmm.
right? The men that, even if they don't actively want to burn the world down, wouldn't care at all to have it all burned. They'll play the harp just like Nero did. And
Yeah.
to me, those are the most elusive people on the planet. And that's fundamentally, I think, what the idea of the book was. It was like, you know, if you were to say, who's the antagonist of the novel, right? It would have to be Fyodor. He's the one that's caused all of the problems. Yes, Smerdyakov ended up killing him, but in the end, Smerdyakov knew the weight of his own guilt, right? That's why he killed himself, because he learned exactly what Ivan learned when Ivan came to him, was that, oh no, everything isn't permitted.
Hmm.
And he ends up killing himself. And he even absolves Ivan of what it was that convinced him to do this thing, which was Ivan. Ivan sort of subtly convinced him to kill Fyodor. And he absolves him by saying, I did this of my own accord. He puts a note on his chest after he hangs himself. Says, I did this of my own accord. So I can't look at Smerdyakov as the antagonist of the novel. I have to look at it like Fyodor.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's the jester in this drama that's just causing turmoil and making a joke and a mockery of everything. It's like at the beginning of the novel, whenever it talks about one of the women that he'd been involved with, he ends up sending her off and she ends up like dying in a garret, and he goes to the town and finds her and finds out about it and runs to the middle of the street and starts wailing in the middle of the road as if he
Mm-hmm.
cared at all, right? But that was the whole Zosima bowing down thing. That harkens back to the same thing that I brought up earlier as the second primary theme, which is the father, right? So Zosima and the importance of the family. Zosima bows down before Dmitri and leaves a coin in front of him. And fundamentally, what I'm guessing that represents is that because he is the firstborn son, it's going to start with him and it's going to be a cataclysm for the rest of them, right? And that's why Dmitri ends up getting caught up in the most immiserating stuff that's involved in the novel, which is not only being accused of, but convicted of a crime that you did not commit and sent off to Siberia to work hard labor in the freezing cold for 8 years. An innocent man, right? It's like when a father disregards his responsibilities, it's the innocent that bear the brunt of it. It's
Mm-hmm.
not the Joker father who doesn't care about anything. It's not him. It's the people he was responsible for. So as far as the psychology around those people, I can't really tell. They're the most elusive beings on the planet to me. But I know the effects that they have, and it's destructive.
Mm. Yeah, with Smerdyakov, um, what kind of confused me, I think, throughout the book was, do they know that he's their brother, or is that, I mean, it was kind of like I c- I c- I could never really tell whether they knew he was their brother or not, or I knew he knew that he was Fyodor's son, And Fyodor was basically having him live in the house as basically a servant, which is like, I think one of the most vile things. That whole thing was like probably the most vile thing I think Fyodor did was, the woman being, not having all of her faculties and then
Things
having
of
a
that.
child. Yeah. That took a turn I was not expecting when they started talking about, like, oh, okay, who's this interesting character he's going to talk about? Oh my God, like, and they never, and Dostoevsky's so artful about it. He never explicitly says that
Right.
Fyodor did what he did, but it's implied. And then you kind of backtrack and you're like, oh, wait a minute. Oh my God. Like, this guy is awful. And then to
So
have the son live as like your servant basically and treat him like crap, is like, you know, it's just
so
vile.
Smerdyakov to me, well, I'll just comment first on. I think the writer Dostoevsky wanted you to, as the reader, determine whether or not this was his kid, and the best way that you were going to determine it was to discover that he was the one that killed Fyodor.
Mhm.
Right. So let's take other literary works just so I can illustrate this. Let's take Lord of the Rings. So what happens in Lord of the Rings? Right. So Sauron creates this ring in which he imbues all of his hatred, malice, and power into, and he pretty much binds to this ring. And what happens is Frodo doesn't throw it into the fire. It is bitten off his hand by someone else who has also touched the ring. And those two go down into the fire together. But the thing about it is not only did Sauron make this ring, but he also made the creatures that were exposed to it. And those creatures ended up killing him by taking his ring into Mount Doom. So to sum up what I said in a little bit of a shorter way, evil kills itself. Evil kills itself. Right? So it's the weight of Fyodor's evil that ends up being his own undoing. And who does it? The one that took the brunt of the most, like the greatest portion of that evil, just like with Gollum in the ring.
Yeah, that's a good comparison.
Yeah.
What do you think of as far as like the other brothers though? Do you think they knew? Because there's even at the end, so what's the kid? The boy that Alyosha, not Ilyusha, but the other boy,
Kolya.
Kolya, yeah. Kolya asks him, was it your brother? Was your brother innocent? After
No, the
Dmitri.
lackey killed him.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And I was like, not only does Alyosha say, no, it wasn't Dmitri, but he says, no, my brother didn't kill my father. I don't know if I'm reading too much into that or.
Again, I think Dostoevsky wanted you to figure that out on your own.
Mm.
I would say it's obvious that Dostoevsky wrote this character in as their brother. As far as the kids were concerned, though, they never ever intimated that they thought or believed that this guy was their brother.
Mm.
You were supposed to pick up on that on your own, right?
Yeah. I think it was pretty, like you said, I think it was pretty obvious. And as I'm asking questions, you say like they're getting into like the psychology of it. I think part of that is because the characters he created became so, I mean, these characters like were accompanying me, in the car ride to work while I'm listening to the audiobook. They're accompanying me while I'm cooking breakfast, reading in bed. The characters are so vivid and so you get so close to their thoughts, at least to an extent. They become so real. I think that's why I started wondering more of like wanting to know everything they were thinking, I guess, which is like, it's so weird. Like the way things are written today, there's this like show, don't tell. Dostoevsky did not do that here, but it was awesome. It was awesome that he just straight up told you what was going on and what they were thinking, and it worked. So, it's just, It's just very
He
weird
actually
how
really
things change.
he mastered that because
Mm,
like in his earlier novels, particularly The Idiot and Demons, he does the same thing, but it's very hard to tell who's speaking, right? So he really got better at it. Like he really, by the time he got to the Brothers Karamazov, that style was mastered. And I mean, like he was the kind of writer that would do numerous drafts on these enormous books, 600-700 page books. If you haven't read The Idiot, I mean, within 30 pages, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It won't
mm.
come off the page in the same with the same fluidity that the Brothers Karamazov does. But yeah, I like that style too. Sort of like barring no punches,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, it can be done badly, but
Mhm.
this was like, I remember thinking like, oh, this is like not what you're told to do. This is not like what you're not supposed to just straight up say this is what they're thinking. And it's like, well, why not? I mean, if you can do it well, maybe there'll be more of that someday. But
And just to add to that, whenever you think about the nature of how entertainment was uh, disseminated to the public back in those days, if I remember correctly, Dostoevsky didn't like he didn't just take numerous years to write this thing. He published these in like periodical entries.
yeah.
So like he's working on a timetable here, writing this insane novel that would be remembered as one of the greatest of all time. Like
Yeah,
to be
it's
able to do that under pressure and to master it is something else, man.
no, absolutely. And that's something that's common. You'll see with like much older literature. Like if you look at the publication date on like the Wikipedia page for something, or the Amazon page for well, I guess Amazon would just put the last year, but like on the Wikipedia pages for a lot of books that are written then, it's like 1780 to 1780 something else. Like there's, and it's like, how was a book published over time? And it's like, well, they were serialized a lot of times, or they
Right.
were printed in magazines. Like even Catcher in the Rye, was published, a little portions of it were published in different magazines before he turned it into a book. So I guess it's not that long ago that
Yeah.
people were still doing that. I guess the main theme I saw in the book, and probably most embodied in Alyosha, was love,
Yes.
and love for precisely those people who are the most difficult to love, I guess. For I saw that with him, and I saw that in the Grand Inquisitor, which we can get to. But I see this idea over and over again where either Alyosha or someone else um, is kind of like attacked or beaten down or demeaned or something, and doesn't retaliate, and not only doesn't retaliate but actually moves closer to the person who's hurting them, like with the Grand Inquisitor, who's being berated for you know this whole long chapter, and then just gets up and kisses the guy on the lips. um Alyosha's getting rocks thrown at him by the kid he's trying to save from
Yeah.
getting rocks thrown at him.
Yeah. Oh man, don't you end up just loving Ilyushka?
Oh yeah, it
It's
was,
like
yeah,
I
that
remember
was,
the last I confess, the last time I read the book, those last three like pages, I was quite literally crying
oh
heavily.
yeah.
I couldn't believe it. I was like, I couldn't believe how he connected you with this character and how much you cared about him by the time like it was over.
With him and with the father, the whole scene, every time you went in that house, it was just like, good lord, like there's just so much going on here. You got mom who's crazy, you got daughter in the wheelchair, you got the father who's been humiliated by Dmitri for, I don't even know exactly what it was that he did, but that Dmitri humiliated him for. But for some reason, he pissed off Dmitri, and he drags him out by the beard, the wisp of toe thing. And then Ilyusha, on top of that, he's like this, beautiful kid, and he's sick, and eventually he's the one that dies in the family.
Well,
And
now notice here the same theme with the brothers
mm,
is present with Ilyushka and his parents, right?
mm,
So you've got the dad that, although he seems noble of heart, is quite literally a drunken, irresponsible mess, right? You've got his mother, who is, the only way you can describe her is stupid, daft. I mean, she can barely speak a sentence. His siblings are useless. They live in this shack,
mm,
and the father kind of won't go to work. Now, there's another character that's quite like him in another one of Dostoevsky's books, which is why I keep thinking about this theme of parenthood that just pervades his work, which is the father that Raskolnikov gets familiar with in Crime and Punishment, Sonya's dad. He is also somebody who could do better in life, but is instead this drunken lout who won't do anything with his life. And it's his kids who are going to be faced with the trial there. So there's this consistent theme, and you contrast the family of the brothers with Ilyushka and his family, and you can just see this catastrophe, except it hit Ilyushka way earlier than what it did the boys. And the message there is that it's like, well, even if some of you live to age, there's no guarantee that you all are, especially if you find yourself in the throes of being the responsibility of someone who can't take on any responsibility, if that makes sense.
mm.
So
Yeah, with with Ilyusha, I definitely was crying a few times with maybe when he was dying. But really when all the boys came to see him, so like the way I looked at it was like it starts out with Alyosha coming across these kids, and they're throwing rocks at some other kid, and Alyosha is like, I forget how many boys there are, but he's like, what, 6 or 10 against one? That's not really fair. So he
right.
gets in between the boys who are doing the rock throwing and the little kid Ilyusha, who's standing there. And at first, you definitely empathize with him right away, because like, hey, why are they throwing rocks at him? But then he throws a rock at Alyosha from behind for no reason. He's like, hey, I'm trying to protect you. And then he's throwing rocks at him. And then the other boys are trying to tell Alyosha that Ilyusha is this really bad kid, and he stabbed this guy with a penknife, who we later meet later. That's Kolia, who's a very interesting young man. But and the whole time, Alyosha is chasing after Ilyusha, trying to talk to him. He somehow figures out that he's pissed off at him because he's a Karamazov, and Dmitri humiliated his father. So he's holding a grudge against the Karamazovs. And even after all that, Alyosha still goes to his house to, or no, he doesn't go to his house right away. But he still tries to like keep getting closer to the kid. I mean, there's specific places where Dostoevsky even talks about how like he inches closer, or he takes another step closer. And Ilyusha wants to kind of let his guard down, but he's not ready yet. In that first encounter they have, he's still not ready, but he's still kind of looking at Alyosha like, maybe this is somebody I can trust. Maybe this guy isn't going to hurt me. Um, you know, but actually, no, I'm going to keep throwing rocks at him, and then later in the story, I got so excited when he started going, I forget what the context was, but he had to visit this kind of broken down shack. And I was like, I wonder if that's where Ilyusha lives, because the kids mentioned that he lives in this kind of broken home. And I was so excited when I found out that that's was his house. So I was like, awesome, there's going to be more about this kid. And not just him, but the other boys as well. At the very end of the book, where Ilyusha is dying, I'm not sure what he's dying from. He's just sick, I guess.
I think it was consumption.
Consumption, yeah. Not exactly sure what that is. I don't know if it's like a catch-all for tuberculosis or
yeah, like TB. TB was real bad. 18th century Russia.
And he's what, like 10, 12?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he's dying, and all these boys are hanging out with him. Basically, they're hanging out with the family. They're consoling the father when he does die. And chief among these boys is Kolya, the kid that Ilyusha stabbed with a penknife. And you learn about all this backstory of how the two of them were friends, and then I forget what transpired between the two of them, but Ilyusha kind of turned on Kolya and stabbed them with a little penknife. But Kolya didn't tell anybody what happened. I mean, at least he didn't tell his parents. He didn't go and narc on him or anything. But that was why those kids were throwing rocks at him, right? Was to kind of get back at him for that. And what I really liked, what I found was so moving, with Alyosha, Kolya, the other boys, and them kind of converging around Ilyusha, was this theme of loving the people that are hardest to love. Like Ilyusha, from the perspective of these young kids, Ilyusha was just this bad kid that stabbed people and throws rocks at people, and his house is all crazy and messed up, and he's just a bad kid. He's kind of like Huckleberry Finn or something like that. He's just not good. And they kind of follow after Kolya because they'll just do whatever he does, because I guess he's like the cool kid in the class.
Yeah,
but
he
Kolya,
says, Dostoevsky says, precocious.
Yes, yeah, a precocious 10 or 11-year-old kid. Yeah. Very very continental, I guess. At least he takes himself to be. I thought it was funny when he was talking about like different books with Alyosha,
Voltaire and stuff.
Yeah, and he's like, "Have you read so and so?" And he's like, "Well, not exactly, but I've read about him, or something. I read a paragraph about him somewhere." But the whole time, Alyosha is not belittling to him. He treats him as an equal. He treats him as like he doesn't argue with him really. He kind of lets him go on his diatribes about socialism and literature and all this stuff that he doesn't really understand. And Alyosha just kind of lets him go, and Kolya likes that. He likes that he's able to feel respected, and Alyosha doesn't lose anything by doing that. He's able to because for Alyosha, I mean, this is after his big spiritual experience that he has after Zosima's death. But even besides that, Alyosha is a monk, so he's got he's got Christ on his mind as like the model, for behavior. And Christ hangs out with prostitutes, gamblers, tax collectors, all the bottom of the barrel people in society, and hangs out with them. And so I feel like Alyosha is embodying that in
Yes.
when Alyosha and the boys are all around him, and they're like, "Remember when we used to throw rocks at him, and then we realized he's actually not so bad." And these boys are literally like holding up his father, who is just a wreck. They're like, keep it together, man. Like, well, these boys are carrying this their friend's coffin.
Yeah, that was tough. That was tough to listen to read. And the last page of the book, they're all together, Alyosha, because it's at this point It's just Alyosha and the kids. And that's where the final triumph, so to speak, happens. When at the end of all this and the suffering that went on with Alyosha and the fact that they all converged in love around him, whenever Kolya asks him, so does this mean there is a God? And Alyosha says yes, and they all jump up and down.
Yeah.
The core message of the book is like overwhelming. And it really starts when Zozima dies, right? Zozima dies and he faces his first trial. And that is that the man that he believed to be the closest representation of the good in the world, and the one he chose to learn under by choice, by volition, instead of being with his dad, passes away, and for the strangest and most bizarre and most banal reason anyone could ever drum up in their head, is disgraced after death, all for the sake of politics within the monastery.
Mm-hmm.
And this sends him into a fit. And it opens him up to temptation. And that's where Razumitin comes in and provides his first temptation. It's just something little. Just eat this sausage, friend. Why don't you have you a sausage?
Mm-hmm.
Right. He says, well, let's have your sausage. But he doesn't eat it. He sort of just holds it. I think he hands it back to him, and Razumitin says, well, come on, come walk with me. We've got some things to discuss anyway. And so Razumitin carries him off by the arm, and he has sort of this diatribe with him, and Alyosha's not really listening, and he's too fraught with anxiety and negative emotion, and it turns out he's leading him to Grushenka.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And Grushenka is the love interest between Fyodor Karamazov and Dmitry Karamazov. They love the same woman. She's something of the temptress in the story. Turns out she's actually also kept by a guy in town named Samsonov. So you can sort of formulate your own opinion about this kind of woman and how she might have been perceived in Russian society in the 18th century. And he's leading him to her. And as far as the book is concerned, the way Grushenka is described is breathtakingly beautiful.
Yeah.
Like beyond your wildest imagination. She's the ideal woman when it comes to beauty, as far as how Dostoevsky described her. And she's going to, as it were, pull that cassock off his body. And whenever they get together, he faces his next trial, which is, can he overcome the temptation of probably the most beautiful woman he's ever met, offering herself up on a platter? And it's not that he conquered it. It's that whenever the moment came that she revealed an inner turmoil that was actually haunting her and causing her to do all this stuff, it was at that moment that the Jesus in him, the Zozima in him, pounced, but with love. Mm-hmm. And from that moment on, her and his relationship was solidified in a mutual respect. And that's what he does with everybody along the way, and including the kids. And that's why at the end, when it all sort of fountains up, past all the tragedy, past all the discussions about whether or not God even exists at all, these kids all happy and on board with like what Alyosha has got going on. And the reason why I think that he chose to make that the last page is that before you even turn the first page, there's a quote from the Bible. I can't remember where you find it. It's actually a red letter passage where Christ says, verily, verily, I say unto thee, but if a corn of wheat fall to the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. Mm-hmm. Now, that's kind of cryptic, but you can imagine a wheat stalk, right? And if corn or a seed or a grain of that wheat stalk hits the ground, it's going to grow, or at least has the potential to grow, into a new plant. However, if I leave the seed on the plant, it will simply continue to be part of the plant that it is a member of. So the reason why Christ said this was that the apostles were asking him kind of like, what's going to be going on here in the next little while with you, Jesus? And he's pretty much saying, well, I'm going to be put to death. But don't worry, because what's going to happen as a result of my death is that it's going to fundamentally change the fabric of reality. And if you think that that's an exaggeration, you might consider the idea that there probably isn't a force in known human history that has been more consequential than this man being put to death, even if you don't believe it and it's just a piece of mythology to you. The idea that this man was put to death and caused that much society changing influence says quite a deal about this story. And that's the fundamental predicate of the story. He has you consider this Bible verse before you even jump into the book. At the end of the book, what's happened is that, sure, Ilyushka is dead, but as a result of that, as a result of all of these boys coming together and loving, they are all now equipped to be on the same page that Alyosha is, who is the person that made it happen, in spite of all the temptations that he's faced along the way, in spite of watching his dad die, his brother be sent off to Siberia, tempted by women, have his hero completely disrespected and shamed and disgraced. At the end of it, he's still the triumphant hero. And so it kind of, the fundamental message of, if you could distill it into words, what Alyosha represents, irrespective of how you end up leaving the book as far as your beliefs concerned, it's that it's neither about belief, nor is it about atheism, nor even philosophy, that defines one as the hero of their own life and of their own path that's laid before them. What defines you in the face of adversity, in the presence of strife and misery and tragedy and death, can you, as an individual, choose to walk the path in front of you, upright, noble, adhering to your values, principles, and your virtues, instead of relinquishing yourself to the wise old spirit that's talked about in the Grand Inquisitor, that of the devil, with love and mercy and reward that he's offering himself. See, the devil in Dostoevsky's work is a loving devil. He loves humanity just as much as God loves humanity, which is a funny little topic to play with. But he's offering you reward and love. Can you, in the face of all of that, keep to your values and principles and virtue and not give in to it, and demonstrate to the devil why it is you need him? And that's Alyosha. He's the guy, the only one in the whole story that did that, which is why he's the hero. Actually, the other guys, the other people that maintain the sort of father role. So there's Farapont, then there's the crazy guy that's outside. The problem with Farapont is he's political. He's exactly what you don't want to be if you have a faith in God. If you have like a true Christian belief, you do not want to be political. However, on the flip side of that, you've got another guy that's to be contrasted with Zosima inside the monastery, and he's the guy that's like outside, being weird, talking about being able to see devils and stuff. He's the holy.
Isn't that Farapont? I think so. Yeah.
Which one's the one that's
Piety, maybe Father Piety?
Yeah, that sounds a little bit more.
Yeah, there were a few of them. Yeah, whoever it was, whichever, the one who was the ascetic and the one that was saying he sees the devils and he says there's a Holy Spirit and a Holy Ghost. Which just seems like just like a troll comments, like just trying to incite riots, like by saying that.
Well, you got to think of it like this: in the Christian doctrine, as far as I'm aware, God is referred to as the spirit of calm, right? And he's also calmness and serenity and peace, right? Peace and love and serenity. That's kind of what God's characteristics are, especially the New Testament. But he's also the cold, calculating God that can create planets and interstellar systems, right? So we're talking about, if you really want to break it down, we're talking about a God that is cold, calculating, peaceful, serene, and loving. Now, whenever you meet these people that are like, and that perfectly describes Zozima, what I just said. Perfectly. Like Zozima is all about peace. He hates strife and confrontation, but he's smart. He knows when to get out of a situation. He knows when to stop a situation. And he knows how to be subtle about it too. Right? So Zima represents to Alyosha the ideal Christian, the ideal representative. But you get these guys over here like Farapont, who are what Dostoevsky referred to as holy fools. They're the exact opposite of what you should be. And they're these crazy, emotional, not smart, not calculating. They're politically motivated, stuff like that. So like he's got these perfect like metrics to go by, Alyosha does, to not be the guy he doesn't want to be, right?
So when Zosima dies, like that is one of the things that you'll hear, like when the saints or saintly people die, they don't smell. And so when Zosima's body starts to smell, they're all like, oh my God. Or actually, the only one who's like, oh my God, is Alyosha. Everybody else is like, yeah, we never really believed in this guy. And, all this political craps just starts coming out. And the whole thing is so bizarre. Like you said, it's like the weirdest reason to shame somebody is like because their body started smelling after they died. Like, and it's, even within the context of like, say, believe in that sort of thing, the idea that that could possibly be this huge calamity, it's just so strange, so forced. And it's not that, I don't think it's just that the breath of corruption emanates from his corpse that challenges Alyosha. It's also, if not mostly, the fact that nobody else seems to respect this guy anymore. And he's kind of like, what am I supposed to do? Who should I listen to? Like, should I listen to the part of me that knows Zosima and learned from him all those years, or should I listen to all these jerks that are, disgracing his name now? He goes to Grushenka, and she tells the story about the onion. And I loved the story about the onion. When it first started, I was like, what is she doing? And then after once Alyosha kind of tied it all in, Grushenka tells this story first of someone else, right? And then tells it about herself. So she tells about a peasant woman who was, I guess, very bad. And it was kind of similar to the story of Lazarus, not the Lazarus that was raised from the dead, but Lazarus, the one who mistreated his servants and then went to hell and was like, oh, guess I shouldn't have done that,
Yeah.
Kind of like that, where she's like in this pit of fire, and she's given an onion by an angel, and she holds on to, he says, just hold on to the onion and I'll pull you out. But then all these other people start grabbing onto her onion, and they're like, we want to leave too. And she's like, no, this is my onion, screw you, and tries to kick them off. And when she does that, she falls back in. And so Grushenka says, I forget what exactly this context was, where she saw a sick peasant woman, and she's like, I gave her an onion. That might be the only good thing I've ever done in my life, but I gave her an onion. And maybe that one little thing, as sort of an aside there, it reminded me of this concept that's present in other religions too, this idea of being weighted down by your sins. Like in some like Egyptian mythology, I've heard, like there's this like story in the religion of like, when you die, you have to cross this river. And if you're very sinful, you're going to be very weighted down and you're going to fall and you're going to sink. But if you are, very righteous, you don't have a lot of sins weighing you down, you can cross the river. I think you get like eaten by alligators or something if you fall in. So something bad happens. So this idea of like getting weighted down by your sins kind of stood out to me. And that story where Alyosha, the way I interpreted it was that Alyosha says, wow, if this woman who's supposedly this, they call her this horrible creature. That's like the phrase they call her all the time, the horrible creature. They don't even call her by name a lot of times.
Yeah, she's the chaotic feminine element in the book.
Yeah. That wretched woman, that horrible woman, that horrible creature, they call her. And he's like, she seems to have taught Alyosha something in that moment, because then when he leaves, now he's alone. He hasn't been alone like since Zosima died. Zosima dies, he's surrounded by these other monks who are putting all these other confusing ideas in his head. This other guy, Rasputin, who's taking him to the guy he's going with to Grushenka. He's filling his head with all kinds of bad ideas, and now he's on his own, and he has that I guess kind of a vision of that story of the wedding at Cana, where Christ turned the water into wine and all that. But it's more importantly, it's a vision of I guess Zosima kind of talking to Alyosha, and in basically, in short, what I thought that experience represented was Alyosha is now making that choice, taking that leap of faith to trust his own intuition about Zosima, to be like, it doesn't matter that his body smelled. He was a good dude. And so the contrast there is that with the onion for Grushenka, it took just one good deed to redeem her. With Zosima, it took just one bad thing to disgrace him.
Yes.
Something over which he had zero control, by the way, too. But that to me was like very interesting. And then once Alyosha was on his own and was able to trust that intuition of like, I mean, Zosima didn't just give one onion. I mean, he gave a whole bunch of onions, I guess you could say. So he was like, you know what? I don't care what those other guys are saying. I know what my experience has been with him. I know what my experience is with God. And it seems like he believes in a loving God, in a God that is like super forgiving, that it really doesn't take much to get forgiveness. And it's then after that he leaves the monastery and goes and sojourns in the world, which that's one question I wanted to ask you at some point, Garrett, was what you think he means by sojourning in the world. And like, what do you think, why do you think he was told to do that? And what do you think that meant?
So my grandfather used to say that wisdom was a dear teacher, from that old saying. He would constantly tell me, wisdom was a dear teacher, one only a fool chooses to learn from. So I wrote a response to that a while back, as sort of a poem, and it fundamentally ends with, wisdom is a dear teacher, one only a fool elects to ignore. And the thing about Zosima was that he represents having gone through the world, experienced what the world had to offer, and to by choice coming to the decision to follow the grand ideal, which is the figure of Christ. Now, the thing that's really striking with Zosima's relationship with Alyosha is that it's kind of like that. It's kind of like the Lion King, right? So Zosima represents the old wise father, so to speak, much like Mufasa does to Simba. But much like Mufasa, Zosima dies, right? And it is now Simba and Alyosha's task to venture out into the world. And the first thing that they encounter is temptation, while leaving, so to speak, the kingdom of God behind them. And Alyosha has a very similar procession, like as far as realization is concerned, as Simba does. He remembers who he is, where he comes from, and what his task is. That's why whenever he leaves Grushenka's place and he has this sort of epiphany situation, he immediately removes his cassock, puts on his normal human clothes, and immediately goes to his family to try and fix the situation. Because it's only through that giving of that onion that you can ever expect it. And who is Alyosha to be despairing about this strange disgrace that Zozima's dealing with now, if he has been living this entire time in a nest full of people who need an onion, right? Because that's fundamentally what you realize Zozima's been living with, is a bunch of vipers, right? So that's all he really needed to have that epiphany, much like Simba just needed to have Nala come back and say, hey, snap the hell out of it before everything goes to shit. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to Zozima and why he told Alyosha to go do that, it's like, because you can't get the why of things without discovering the what of things. Like, you have to go out into the world and experience. It's very much like learning anything, right? Like, I'll never be able to be a pianist if I don't sit down at the piano, right? Like, if you're learning this stuff by rote, which is not what Zozima was all about, you're not really doing it, are you? Right? Like, if you're just reciting the catechisms because, well, that's just what we do on Sunday, or that's just what we do at Mass, well, that's not really what we're all about here. And at one of the main themes that you get out of the Brothers Karamazov is a scathing critique of modern organized religion. It's so overwhelmingly scathing, it's not funny. I mean, even whenever you're talking about the Grand Inquisitor, I mean, like, that's where it all just like peaks as far as like, what the hell's wrong with Christianity? You know what I mean?
I found it interesting that Alyosha's his moment of doubt doesn't come from Ivan's recounting of the Grand Inquisitor. Dealt with very briefly. Alyosha's like, okay, that was weird. Let's move on. But with this Zosima thing, you know, so it wasn't. That was the other theme I thought was. You know, I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but for me, it was that conversion from, and it doesn't have to be from atheism to religiosity, or it could just be like recommitting to faith you already have, but some kind of conversion experience or some kind of spiritual awakening isn't something that can be argued into somebody. Like, they can't be debated into, convinced through arguments. Yet at the same time, Dostoevsky's not anti-intellectual. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that he was, at least for some portion of his life, an atheist, and a pretty damn smart one too. And he was also a pretty damn smart Christian. You know, his being smart didn't change when he converted, but his conversion, as far as I can tell, was not through thinking logically about stuff. It was through feeling like he had been rescued from certain death. You know, something you can't buy that. You know, can't buy an experience like that at the store. And this whole theme of like that you can't be like logicked into spiritual awakening, almost to the point where those kind of experiences happen only once. For me, the way I understand is they happen precisely at the point where logic and reason have stopped functioning, or have done all that they can do, you know, which is to say they're not it's not that they don't serve any purpose or that they're opposed to faith or religion, but that they serve a purpose up to a certain point. And I think you see that sort of disintegrate in the monastery at Zosima's funeral, because what's going on there is irrational. There's no justification for it. It's just greed, basically. And then to cap things off, you have this crazy guy, this loon, come in talking about seeing devils and monsters, and they're like, this is the man we want. You know,
don't you find it a little funny that by the end of the novel, the person that's propped up to you, presented to you as the intellectual hero of the novel, Ivan, is also seeing devils. He's
oh
not
yeah, that's
just
true.
dream, by the time he's delirious and realizes Smerdyakov killed him and he's got the evidence and he goes in to save his brother, he's like going crazy, seeing
Mhm.
devils and stuff everywhere. So there's no coincidence that not only did Dostoevsky want to present a scathing critique of Christianity and present to you, even as a believer, the best argument against Christianity, but he also wanted to present the best argument against reason, right? It's the most reasonable guy in the whole book that loses his mind. And it's because he stepped over that demarcation line from, yeah, sure, you're a reasonable guy, but what happens if you do something that's irrational? Or what happens if you accidentally reason somebody into doing it for you?
Mhm.
You gonna feel like everything's permitted then? It's like, sorry, buddy, you're not going to. You're going to lose your mind, and you're going to watch your brother go to prison for crimes he's not guilty of, and it's going to be your fault, and it's going to drive you mad. And he did this with a number of characters. Raskolnikov was the first time I think he tried to tackle this concept, right? Because Raskolnikov believed he was sort of a Napoleon-esque figure. There was something you said a minute ago that really struck me, and I can't remember what it was. I'll remember it later.
Well, I was gonna ask if you think that when it comes to the rationality and reason and all that stuff, and with like Yvonne going crazy from brain fever, and the way I'm thinking of it is like, when reason is all there is, if you do something unreasonable, then it's like, what else is there to do but go crazy? I mean, on the other hand, with something like faith in something, in mercy and love and all that stuff, it's almost, I don't know, maybe it's like, it's not that faith and mercy and love and that sort of thing is opposed to rationality and logic, but actually it's precisely what allows you to be irrational at times. It allows for the possibility that as a human being, not as a god, you're going to make mistakes from time to time. But if all there is reason and logic, then it's like, then I can either be logical or illogical. I can't be a human being who makes a mistake. And I mean, that's like where that's what's so perverse about the reaction to Zosima's body giving off the breath of corruption, is like, really, that's all it took? Like, I mean, that's all it took to ruin this guy's reputation for these guys. And I mean, there's also the other aspect that they were like hoping something bad would happen. So maybe some of them harbored some resentment anyway. But I think he made it more or less clear that a lot of them weren't sure what to think until they looked at how the other elders were behaving, and they're like, or the other fathers were behaving, and they're like, okay, I guess we'll just go along with the rest of them. But getting back to my question was, I guess, what did you think about that idea, that like of logic and reason? And I think I asked you this the last time we talked, and I think you made it pretty clear that you don't think that logic and reason itself will lead someone to going crazy, which I
Yeah,
guess it would make sense. That they kind of contradict one
it's
another.
not that. And your other thing earlier, it's like you asked what would it be that could help get people to the point where they believe they actually have that sort of experience. Again, I reiterate what I said last time. It's going to be a miracle for people who are logic prone and rationality, like devotees, like say myself. See, the thing about this is, like, it actually is quite simple, and people just kind of aren't checking it out. It's not rationality that's the problem. It's reliance on rationality above all things, right? So because
Hmm.
you have a limited capacity, right? Like, you and I both have sort of a set intellectual threshold, right? Now you can expand the base of your knowledge and stuff, and you can expand the base of your skills, but you will hit peak skill. You will hit peak capacity to comprehend things, right? So you have a set limitation on how much you can apply logic, rationality, reason, and, well, everything that's attendant upon the philosophical arts, right? So if you're wholly reliant on that, whenever you finally reach that point where like your logic's not helping you here, and like you've got to make a split decision based on something that isn't logic, well, that's where irrationality is going to come in, and your emotions are going to dominate you, right? And that's where you end up getting into trouble, because emotions aren't rational most of the time. I mean, for example, I mean, we've got more people walking around with generalized anxiety disorder than ever before, even though anxiety is specifically a part in the function of the human being that's supposed to help you navigate threats against your person. And you see what I mean? Like there are evolutionarily advantageous elements of our cognition that are now dominating our brains completely irrationally, right? So the idea that emotion is predicated on anything rational at this point is kind of absurd. So you really only have logic. It's the only thing that's going to get you at least as far as you can get before irrationality has to set in. And it's at that point where, right, it's even like this. Dostoevsky tried to make this case and ended up making it for me, right? It's like with Raskolnikov, he gets to that point and then ends up doing something insanely irrational, which is kill somebody, right? That's not rational. That's not his logic. That's not his logic dominating his brain. That's his irrational desire to be the savior and to be the Napoleon. So even though he tried to make the case that it was logic and rationality doing this, he did the exact opposite. The same thing goes for Ivan. It's like, Ivan doesn't start breaking down until his brain starts going into fever fits, and he starts having conversations with the devil, who actually are only himself, which is actually a really cool part of the book, because the whole idea was that you are the devil.
Yeah, the devil in Dostoevsky's book here was like with Ivan, it kind of had like it's almost like written, it was written almost like it had the feeling of like a different author. It had more of like a almost like a Monty Python kind of like very distinctly like British kind of humor, very dry humor that kind of like came out of nowhere. And I was like, that was, to me, it was very interesting that he create like how, and it's a challenge for a writer. Like, how do you create a character who's like a hallucination? So he's going to have qualities of the guy who's doing the hallucinating, but also make him like distinct from him so that he can have back and forths between the two. And I feel like, you know, I'm just rethinking about that now, about how good a job he did with that, like making this character. The devil is like, you can, nobody can ever, you're always going to be disappointed. You know, when you meet the devil in a film or a story, you're always going to be disappointed because like it's the devil. I mean, it's like, you know, same thing with like God, you know, and that's why I love like South Park. Whenever they depict God or the devil, they don't even put any effort into it. Like it's just because they're like, yeah, it's like we can never top your expectations, so we're not going to try to.
To be frank, if you want to look for the devil and a good representation, look no further than a mirror. Really. And I do mean that. And people with vices know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like, so if you're an alcoholic or you're a drug user, you already know that your greatest enemy is the person talking inside your head, convincing you that it's a good idea to just go ahead and use one more time, right? And that's why Ivan is contrasted with the devil, and he keeps saying, you're just repeating the things that I've already drummed up. You're telling me my own damn stories. And then the devil will come in with this like crazy absurdism, like, yeah, I get it. You think I don't know who you are and all this good stuff. And, you know, everybody's got the wrong idea about me, right? Everybody thinks that I'm just this horrible guy. I'm the only person in the world who is exclusively hated by all people. He even tries to get you to feel bad. And he's like, and I would settle for a life as a 200-pound merchant's wife, and I would go to church and sing the songs and be happy just like the rest of you. But no, I can't do that. I don't know why I can't do that. very, very weird way of looking at the devil. That although you're right when it comes to the idea that most of the time in literature or entertainment, if you're going to depict the devil, it really is kind of underwhelming. It's not the case with Dostoevsky. He gives you an entirely new idea of the devil. Like whenever he talks about being there at the crucifixion and the overwhelming urge to sing Hosanna with the rest of the angels, but just
Mm,
felt that it would be out of place.
yeah.
Very cunning way of representing this entity that we all despise so well. There's this weird thing about encouragement going on in the world. It's like most people don't really have the encouragement they need to be successful in their day-to-day affairs, let alone their like life goals and stuff. And I think that's fundamentally the cataclysm that people like, or characters like Alyosha face whenever Zozima go away. It's like, well, where am I to draw this, right?
Mm.
Especially if not only is he gone, but he's disgraced. It's like, oh, me. That's where I'm to draw it from myself. I have to embody that. I have to embody that ideal that I had put on a pedestal. That's no longer here for me to get comfort from, right? It's the death of the father and the returning home and becoming the father yourself.
Yeah, at the very end of that chapter, the wedding at Cana chapter, there's a line where he says that he fell down on the ground as a weak boy, but then stood up as a man or as something else, and talked about how that one moment would stay with him for the rest of his life, which I thought was that was so cool, like reading something like that. I would imagine that's probably similar to how Dostoevsky felt about whatever his experience or experiences were. Because I think it's the sort of thing that if you haven't had it, it's tempting to think like, well, if I got to write a story and there's somebody who has a spiritual awakening, I'm going to have to make it into like a big fireworks show, because that's what that must be like. It must be like an acid trip or something. And it's like, well,
Right.
maybe for some people, maybe it is, but I think a lot of times it's actually very, first of all, very short lived. Like he mentions it as being like a minute, that 1 minute, will stay with him for his whole life. And it's something that doesn't, you know, the feeling that goes on doesn't stay forever, because then you would just float off if that were the case, go into samadhi. But he does the opposite. He goes and he has that spiritual experience and then plunges into the world, which that's
Yes.
what I find fascinating. And I find that in the Zosima Ferapont kind of dichotomy, where Ferapont is, and I've talked about this in other videos. I'm talking about it, I think, more frequently lately, because it's something I've been thinking about more. The question of asceticism, is like, well, this is the most efficient way to wake up or get liberated or whatever. So why not? Or if I want to live more like Christ, well, Christ didn't do all these things, so I won't do those things, and I'll live like, like St. Francis did, taking up, wearing hair shirts and not eating and things like that. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but the ascetics themselves will be the first to tell people that there are plenty of folks who go into that life for the wrong reasons. And it seems like Ferapont is one of them. He is
Yeah.
one of those guys that in Eastern spirituality, this comes from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the Buddhist teacher, what he calls spiritual materialism, doing spiritual things and getting these spiritual powers and going through these austere practices basically as merit badges, when really what you should be doing is doing them to enrich your own life and to enrich your own experience, not to, certainly not to usurp the throne in a monastery.
Well, you gotta ask yourself, what did people do for dopamine kicks other than alcohol 200 years ago? Right? It's like, dude, religion all over the world for as long as we've been a species has been like the one thing that can provide that. It's why when it comes to like recovery rates and stuff from like alcohol and heroin and stuff, like the number one factor in recovery is a spiritual experience. It's because there's a natural high that we get from it. I think it's because we evolved in such austere conditions that, like, it's kind of like that old saying, if God didn't exist, he would have to be invented. It's like, well, we're kind of evolutionarily engineered to invent him. And that seems to be the case because no matter where you go in human history or across what culture, separated by I don't care how many miles of distance, you have a god or a hero ideal that's worshipped, which is another funny thing that Dostoevsky wanted to talk about in the book, was that even if it comes a day that you abolish all gods from the face of the earth, the first thing man's going to do is find something to bow down and worship. And look out when that day comes. When the day comes when there's no God anywhere to be found, and yet that role needs to be fulfilled. He mentions it across a couple of books in sort of indirect ways. Like, not only was he someone who was formerly a revolutionary utopian of the socialist stripe, he became one of its biggest detractors and most powerful critics. And it's mentioned in the book Crime and Punishment a couple times about, some of the more unscrupulous types that are in the book, talking about joining communes and stuff, and it's the wave of the future and stuff. You don't really get his full blast of like, this whole ideology can just straight go to hell until you get to Demons. And the entire book is what appears to be a drama, but is in fact a scathing critique on the idea that utopianism is going to take you anywhere other than your own death and the death of people that you love, if you love anything at all, still at all. And you're going to be miserable and disgraceful and fundamentally unhappy. That's, again, that's if you don't kill yourself. But there was an aspect of that book. Let me think. Not only was it a critique, it was also a prediction. Like, in that book, he accurately predicted Lenin coming to power. He said that someone exactly like Lenin, and described him in like full force in sort of Dostoevskian manner, someone just like Lenin is going to come to power, and it's not going to be too long from now. And I mean, he was fundamentally correct. And his main idea behind his critique of sort of left-leaning utopianism was that fundamentally they were going to abolish what they thought was abolish God from the face of the planet, and instead turn man into a god, which is already on its face absurd because man can't be trusted to be a god. And what they're going to fundamentally do is build the new tower to heaven, which is going to result in unbridled chaos, the likes of which the world has never seen. And as far as the 20th century is concerned, we stacked up more bodies in the 20th century than in any other century in human history. So I would say he was, even if not 100% accurate, dead on the money, which isn't to be, critical of, sort of new age utopian ideas that may work in practice, especially if they're detached from state power. Because, I mean, there's a lot of socialists out there that would say that one of the primary reasons why, Mao or Stalin or any of those guys failed as miserably as what they did was because instead of it being a stateless society like Marx had conceptualized, it was a tyrannical, imperialistic, strong state society. So whenever you try to equalize things from the perspective of state power, you get exactly what it is that Dostoevsky warned us about. But yeah, as far as like his like direct political leanings, he's never really clear about that. I'm sure there's probably some writings on it. I mean, one of his first books was called Poor Folk, about peasants and stuff, or people in their plight, like poor people in their plight. But
so like with Ilyusha's situation, for example, the more economically grounded idea of what a good, virtuous conduct looks like is, well, you want his situation to improve, well, get him a better house, get him out of the shack. That's why he's so miserable. But then it's like that doesn't really translate as well when you look at like Ivan. It's like, why is he so miserable? He's in this big house with servants and he still kills himself. He still goes crazy. I was starting to see that already in like Alyosha. Like Alyosha is not a social reformer. He reforms people, in conversations by standing in front of kids, throwing rocks.
Yep.
That's how a revolutionary would be like, this takes too long. We need to hurry up,
Yeah, I mean, there's an unfortunate truth that people who are involved in politics and collectivist ideas are going to have to not wrestle with, because they can never do it. It's not a possibility. I assert this now forcefully. The one thing that they're going to have to wrestle with is the fact that there is no such thing as a collective. There are simply groups of individuals. There's no cutting this any other way. Individuals are the only creatures, the only beings that act. Only individuals act. And that's the point of Alyosha. Can you, as the individual, in spite of all the suffering, in spite of all the nonsense even, act according to what you regard to be the ideal virtue? And can you spread that everywhere you go? Because that's your only salvation, man, right? Like, you're going to die at the end of this. And chances are your society's not going to be the way you want it to be, because there's no such thing as society being the way you want it to be, because society is comprised of individuals who act differently than you. And that will always, always be the case. That's why philosophy needs to be reinvigorated in the modern world and reintroduced to kids as young as possible, so that they can avoid all of these ideological traps that are set for people and all these misguided preconceptions about what humans are capable of. It's like, no, you're quite limited in your capacities, but your best way to look at things is from the perspective of, how can I make it better? It doesn't mean you're not going to find yourself in situations where you can't do anything, but the last thing you want to do is be in a position where your situation looks like Ilyushka's, where you're somebody who can't do anything, and the person that has all the responsibility to do anything won't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Right. See, if it was up to Ilyushka's dad, everything would have been a nightmare. But because Alyosha came in and was like, no, let's do something about this. Something at least.
Do you feel like it's impacted your own life in any particular way, or do you think your life's been altered in any way because of reading this book? I don't know if that's a phrase that has meaning for you, or
So it's almost impossible for me to come across thinkers who genuinely contributed to the body of intellectual thought and not integrate what they've got going on. So whenever I first read this book, I was still a Christian, and I became even more of a Christian whenever I finished it. Now, through certain deliberations post reading it, I'm not a Christian. But that doesn't mean I don't understand the value of what it is that this guy was trying to get across with this book, which is sort of reinvigorating the concept of the divine individual, which is fundamentally what Jesus was, right? Christ was the person who lived nobly in the face of adversity and did what he could to fix the world, despite its flaws, despite all the misery, because he chose to. Period. And that's why Alyosha is the hero, because he chose to. Even though he had at least as many reasons not to as everybody else in the book. And the only people that followed that sort of example were happy at the end of the story. And so yeah, I mean, have things stuck with me? Yeah, the the Grand Inquisitor section talking about the nature of society and what the hell's really going on here, and kind of how, whereas Christ during the three temptations resisted and man did not, and took up the mantle of power by actually accepting the three temptations, providing men bread, delivering them mystery, and conquering the nations of the earth. Yeah, that's really important stuff. But really, I just like the Dostoevsky spectacle. That's what I like. I just like that there are human beings that had this in them to deliver it to me, to have me consider it.
Mm.
So yeah, he'll stay with me forever, even if we don't agree on. I mean, most of the stuff me and Dostoevsky don't agree on when it comes to like religiosity.
Mm-hmm.
But there isn't anything about his personal philosophy that I would find doesn't align with me.
Mm. Yeah, it's definitely a very like immersive read. I'm definitely gonna have to read it a second time. I know you said you read it twice in
The same
one
year,
year.
I
Yeah.
couldn't. Every day after I closed the last page, I wanted to pick it back up,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, "No, don't do that. You've never really done that with anything." Couldn't
Mm.
stop thinking about it. I thought, man, it's too lovely. It's too amazing. I mean, he wraps up every human emotion that you can possibly imagine. He wraps up every human temptation that you can possibly imagine. Every human suffering that's intrinsic to our being is wrapped up in this book. All of our influences, as far as like what we should expect out of parents, expect out of society, all of that's covered. I think it was Kurt Vonnegut's wife that said everything you need to know about life is in the Brothers Karamazov.
Really?
Yeah, and I think I would second that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'll definitely have to read it again because I think my main area of interest was probably centered around Alyosha. Definitely, interested in his journey and just seeing. I just was left with like when with like the kiss at the end of the Inquisitor and with Alyosha and the boys at the end of the book. I just had this overwhelming conviction of like, oh yeah, this is how to live. Like that's for me, that's the optimal way to conduct myself is to if somebody, wrongs me 9 times out of 10, best thing to do is probably not get hung up on it and retaliate and because it just leads to misery.
Yes, yes, retaliation is not protection.
Right, yeah.
Revenge is not protection.
Mm-hmm.
Revenge is a choice. So is retaliation. Like you have every right in the world to defend yourself from bodily harm of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
But you do not have the right, thereof, to retaliate when that same force has been stopped, right? And that's the thing about Alyosha is that like he never did rescind that ire
Mm-hmm.
or that rock. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, like I'm with you there.
I'm really, really glad that you told me that how did you put it? If you haven't read the brothers, you can't be a true
Yeah,
intellectual yet.
yeah, I heard somebody say that, and it insulted the crap out of me. I was like, you know what, go to hell. And then I went and bought the book. Oh, and on that note, I actually am pleased to say that you are the third person in the past month that I have actually convinced to read this book.
Really? That's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
I'm
That's
pretty pleased
awesome.
about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really glad you did. It's been a really awesome experience last few weeks. And yeah, I definitely would like to talk to you again on Grand Inquisitor. Like we said, probably deserves its own special treatment, you know.
Yeah, there's a lot wrapped up in there. Even if it's not like a 2-hour thing like what we got going on here,
Mm-hmm.
we could probably touch on just about everything, even if it's not in super great detail. But I was also going to say, anytime you want to do sort of like a novel review or like an epistemology review or something like that, man, I'd be totally willing to do a deep dive as best I can with you on your show.
I was gonna bring that up to you, Garrett. Yeah, do something maybe recurring, something we could probably maybe work
Sure.
out. I definitely like to do that. I'm glad that you reached out to me on that Segru video, because then if you hadn't, I wouldn't have read this book. We wouldn't have had these conversations, and
Yes,
so
Zagru's
it's
great, man.
yeah, that's cool. Yeah, thanks for coming on. Did you have any parting words with respect to the brothers or
No, I would
anything?
just say again, I reiterate, it's the greatest novel of the 19th century. Any of your viewers that are listening, please go read the book. It's
Mm.
awesome. It'll change the way that you look at literature. It'll change your standards for literature entirely. Like the idea that you can go from Brothers Karamazov and read something like J.D. Salinger, it's going to be kind of difficult, but there might still be some value there. But yeah, go read the book. It's awesome. Appreciate you having me on, and I hope you're doing well, and I hope everybody in your audience is doing great too.
Thanks a lot, Garrett. Take
Hey, anytime,
care.
brother. You too.